Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for what is the latest in one of our series of I Am Irwin Mitchell webinars. My name is Glen Whitehead. I'm one of the serious injury solicitors here in Sheffield. It's also my pleasure to welcome here with me today Susan Pattison, who's a chartered physiotherapist and director of SP Therapy Services. Our topic today is on remote therapy. We will know this as virtual therapy. It's got other names: telehealth, digi-health, digital health. Well, for the purposes of today, what I want to do is refer to it as remote therapy, and that pretty much means treatment and assessment by means other than that of face-to-face sessions. The origin of this webinar came about a couple of months ago when I joined Susan and her team in a meeting, an online meeting with a number of therapists present, and we were discussing all the challenges and the many things that were coming to light as a result of the pandemic. We discussed how we were approaching these challenges and whether these were being experienced across the board by everyone, and we thought it would be helpful then to bring that to a wider forum, a larger group. And that's really how this webinar came about. It's an opportunity for us to share experiences with colleagues, clients, members of medical groups and also rehab professionals. And what we don't have for you today, I'm afraid, is a perfect answer to the problem. We don't have a prescriptive approach or a recipe for you to take away, but what this will hopefully do is give you an opportunity really to get together here in this forum, discuss the challenges that we're experiencing, acknowledge those, and hopefully move us to a better place where we can look to grow from this and also start to put into practice a common thread of thinking with regards to remote therapy sessions. I'm hoping that some of you will have already seen some of our existing webinars online. We have a library available to you, so please do and go and look at those. If we don't manage to address some of your questions today, hopefully you'll find the answers on those other webinars. But thank you to all of those that have submitted questions ahead of this webinar. We will be addressing those as we go along. I'm going to break the webinar down into little sections and we'll address those questions in accordance with those sections. There's also a chat function, so if you'd like to forward any ideas, any points, any discussion points or any questions to me via that, we'll see those on our screens and then we can hopefully address those as we go along too. The webinar will be recorded, so you'll hopefully be able to look back over that in the future as well, and it will join our library on the website as well. At some point you'll receive a link to a feedback sheet. It'd be great if you could fill this in. Our intention is to do a further webinar for this later in the future, where we can pool all our thoughts from today, our progression points, and then hopefully again take another look when we're a little step further down the line at how things are progressing. So what I've decided to do, I've broken the subject down today into 3 sections, and I thought it might be helpful to look at the past, how we've sort of done things before now, where we are now as a result very much of the pandemic and how things have progressed to change our practice, and also how we might look at things in the future. It has a little bit of a Charles Dickens Christmas Carol feel about it, so I apologise for that on a sunny day in July, but I thought this was the best way to approach it. I will look at things primarily from a physio perspective. My background is physiotherapy. Susan is a physiotherapist, but that's only really because that's how I can apply my thought process and thinking to it. My understanding is that remote therapy has been very much sort of looked at a lot across other professions as well, and you will have had your own experience of that. And it may be that you have other experiences or the ways in which you develop your practice, so please do shout up if that's the case. From a physio perspective, our past has been very much telephone based when we look at the way in which remote therapy has been provided. Around the late 90s, we looked to nurse consultations, and remote therapy was telephone based. PhysioDirect developed over a decade, whereby what happened is somebody rang up, they essentially took a subjective assessment over the phone, they gave advice based on that subjective assessment. They would send out advice sheets and also exercises, probably with a follow-up phone call or two. Remote therapy was the primary approach, but a face-to-face session was available if absolutely necessary. But it was very much a telephone-based service. Now, these services took various forms, and there have been some studies to look at how effective they were. Now, the main drivers for these sessions was to reduce client waiting lists. There was an element of being more cost effective within the GP setting, and also to enable access to those that perhaps couldn't get into the face-to-face sessions. They were predominantly for musculoskeletal conditions, so I appreciate the research has predominantly been around that kind of physio and treatment and therapy. However, that is pretty much all we had to go on over the last 10 years. Now, Chris Salisbury and colleagues looked at whether PhysioDirect approach, the remote therapy, was effective. They had some pretty positive results and findings from their random controlled trial. They found that it did sort of reduce the waiting lists, it was cost effective, and the effectiveness of the treatment was the same after a 6-month period. There was a little dip at about 6 weeks where actually the remote therapy was found to be more effective in achieving the outcomes than the face-to-face, and then it tailed off and joined up to be similarly so at about 6 months. So the original sort of approach to this was quite well received. If you then look at Enoch's results and his review of the literature in 2014, to look whether it was feasible, whether it could actually be performed and used as a practical approach. And also, again, the findings were quite positive from that approach. The randomised controlled trial was used across 94 GP practices, so it was quite a reasonable sum of patients that were accessing this service, and they found that there was strong evidence to find that it was cost effective. There was moderate evidence to show that it was effective in achieving the objectives of the treatment. However, there was conflicting evidence. There was a mixed reception from the clients that were receiving it. So it wasn't quite sure whether this was going to be an acceptable form of treatment going forwards. So really the key point for this is if we look at sort of into the 2000s and up to 2014 to Enoch's study, we're talking about 15 years there where there has been a very, very slow and gradual sort of approach to this. And I'm aware that a lot of you may know of existing purely online services. Certainly in the field of psychology, I know that it's used regularly. I'm aware of various physiotherapy practices and approaches that are purely online. But on the whole, we have tended to, as therapy providers, we've tended to stick with a face-to-face approach. And I can remember these things being introduced in sort of 2012, 2013 when I was in practice. And I'll stick my hand up in the air now, and I felt at that time that remote therapy wasn't appropriate. It certainly wasn't something that I would look at. And I felt, you know, I treated with my hands, and I didn't feel that it would be something that I would perhaps look at that time. And I can also remember there was quite a lot of discussion in the physio journals and Frontline, etc., about whether this was proper physiotherapy. Is this possible to provide physiotherapy in a remote setting and a virtual setting? So I know there were mixed reviews there. I'd be really interested to know now, if you're able to put via the chat function forwards, your experiences, what you found about the past approach. And I'm going to pass over now to Susan, who's just going to give us her perspective on remote sessions before, in the past, how things have developed for her. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. To put it in context, I'm a neurological physiotherapist of more than 30 years experience. I'm very much a hands-on practitioner. I am very much was in the camp of I couldn't understand how remote therapy would work for my particular group of patients. I understood there was evidence with regards to GP musculoskeletal advice giving, but I didn't see the comparisons between the evidence available and what my patients were experiencing. So I have to say, before the experience that the pandemic brought onto me and the experiment, that I was very much in the no camp when it came to remote therapy. Just to put in context, as well as being a physiotherapist within my team, we also have occupational therapists, and if there are any occupational therapists, I will do my best to answer any questions relative to that. Thank you, Glenn.
Okay, so what we then want to look at really is your views, your sort of experience. Now, I've had a couple of questions before now about how the assessment of spasticity, range of movement, objective measures would be used in a remote setting, and I'm in total agreement. These are the sort of questions that I also had at that time. How do we administer standardized assessments within a remote setting? What were we going to be able to do what we considered our normal role within a remote setting? And I think hopefully that the rest of you would have been asking those questions too when these services were being introduced. Now, again, what I'm hoping is over the next sort of 20 to 30 minutes that you will actually have those questions answered. With regards to looking backwards over the telephone sessions in the past, it might have been quite difficult, but we've seen a rapid development in technology, and hopefully that will have changed how we are now able to perceive and answer those questions. So if we've got no points at the moment of how those questions, how the past therapy was experienced by yourselves, let's move on to where we are now. So let's look at the present. So my approach to remote therapy was sort of summed up in this quote by George Bernard Shaw. Progress is impossible without change, and it was clearly obvious at this stage that if I wasn't going to change my mind about how therapy could be provided, then we're not going to be we're not going to be able to change anything, and progress isn't going to be made. Now in March, our therapists were starting to call us from about March the 16th saying, look, we're not going to be able to see your clients, this pandemic is here, it's starting to affect everything we do, and appointments were starting to be cancelled. It wasn't quite clear, there was a huge degree of uncertainty at that time. Nobody knew what was going on, there was no direction from the professional bodies, no direction from the regulators, so we weren't really sure on what was happening. Now, March the 23rd came along, suddenly we had the guidance from the government and it was lockdown. Everything was going to cease. The regulators, the HCPC and our governing bodies, in our case the CSP, quickly followed with their advice in relation to ceasing all face-to-face contacts that weren't emergency, and we have that situation whereby we've got this fork in the road. We have a choice. Do we continue and adapt, modify the way in which we do things, or do we cease and stop therapy completely? And from our perspective, from a solicitor perspective, a million things come into play there. We've got a client base that clearly are in need of therapy and need of treatment. We've got the safety of those clients is paramount. So these people often have comorbidities. They're a high-risk group for contracting COVID-19, and the prospect of shielding and sort of launching them into a period of time where they have limited contact with the outside world has got huge implications also. So we were in a situation there where we had to try and strike this balance between ensuring that the needs of our clients were met, while at the same time working with our therapy providers, our case managers and our teams that were in place to ensure that our clients were continue to receive the services. Now, as well as those sort of situations about the direct contact with COVID and the implications of contracting it, we've got loads of other factors that fall into that. So the effects of being isolated, the effects of the families whether people are now living alone, whether the network that they relied upon was suddenly shattered and how that was going to affect them. For example, a lot of my clients have brain injuries, and their view of the world is very much reliant upon that support network. And how was that going to change over the next few months if therapy was withdrawn completely, if there was no contact? There was also the implications for the families. Were these clients going to move back in with the families, and what kind of strain was that going to place? We know that a lot of these clients have incredible tensions within their local groups and social groups that are very difficult to deal with. We also know that 50% of traumatic brain injury clients will experience depression at some point in their recovery. So how was this going to be affected by their time in lockdown also? So there were lots of factors here that had to be considered in this fork in the road. And I know all of you will have experienced at some point the thought process about which fork do you take? Do you continue? If you're going to continue, what are the implications for that? As a business, as an entity, as well as an individual with regards to you providing your therapy services. So what I'd like to do now is pass over to Susan, who's going to tell us exactly what happened during that process for her. But again, if any of you out there have got any key learning points or experiences that you had as you hit that fork in the road, if you can pop that on the chat function as well, and by way of a question, then please put that forwards. If we don't get a chance to address it today, then what I'll do is I'll get back to you afterwards. So I'll pass over to Susan to explain how she dealt with this fork in the road. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. I think my slide demonstrates how it felt to me. It was from hands-on to hands-off. As a physiotherapist, I spent 3 years qualifying to learn how to use my hands. I went on postgraduate courses to get better at using my hands. I think as a physiotherapist, my hands are my identity. It's what I do. So I think for physiotherapy, it really shook us that our core value, our core skill was taken away. And I think it was a difficult decision to make. And I think I can only describe not using our hands as almost the unthinkable. But the alternative was even worse. Can I have the next slide, please, Natasha? So I think the thing is that what I was faced with was we needed to provide remote therapy via video link for people living in the communities with complex neurological needs. I was acutely aware that that had not been done before. It wasn't proven, it hadn't even been tested, and there wasn't any time for us to actually communicate our intentions with our solicitors, with our case managers. Our recommendation from our professional body was it was virtual or nothing. Their guidance was limited because the evidence was limited. There was a video on my professional website. It was about a GP consultation about a back pain and interpretation of X-ray. It had absolutely no bearing on my day-to-day encounter with my patients. And then as a businesswoman, I was also very acutely aware that we were going to plunge into this experiment, not knowing whether our actions were going to be supported by our case managers, by our solicitors, or by the funders at the end of the day. So I think it very much felt like we were throwing the dice and we were running the gauntlet to see what was going on. But I think as much as I've written the title of this slide as plunging into the unknown, I think we knowingly plunged into the unknown. And I think we knowingly plunged into the unknown because the alternative was to leave our patients with nothing. And that never, ever crossed our heads. We were going to go in for this full metal and we were going to try. Because the last thing we were going to leave was these very vulnerable individuals socially isolated during this pandemic. So what lockdown gave us was, I think the thing is, we'd been having cup of coffee conversations saying, well, we'll go virtual. But once the decision was made, what that did was that gave us time, and we put the teams into peer support groups and they started to problem solve. How were we going to deliver what we needed to deliver remotely? What we did know is we had established therapeutic relationships with our patients. Our patients trusted us. But because we were community physiotherapists, we also had quite an in-depth knowledge of their buildings, of their environment, of where they were. So we were in quite a positive place. But what we also decided to do very early on is we also decided that as a team of therapists, we weren't very tech savvy. And so we very quickly decided to divide the technical problems away from the therapy problems. We gave our admin team the technical problems and said, work out the how, as in the device, as in the connection, and we will work out what we're going to deliver. And I think with hindsight, that was one of our wisest decisions. Having had the experience of trying to put my mum onto Google Hangouts and nearly pulling my hair out, it can destroy a relationship. So I think separating those relationships was really key to some of the success that we had. Can I have the next slide, please? And we did very much throw the dice. We didn't know what the outcome was going to be. Our patients absolutely responded. When we offered and said, this is what we're going to do, would you like to join us? They absolutely said yes, 100%. In fact, it wasn't 100%, it was an 85% conversion rate that we got. And the thing was, we started off on a safety first basis, and we started off very, very simple. And as our patients' confidence grew and our therapist confidence grew, then we were actually able to start to communicate with our case managers, with our solicitors, with our funders about what it was we were doing. And there started to be a recognition of the value of what we were doing. And therefore, as a result, we ended up being paid for our efforts. Not all, but some. Thank you. So this is where we've got to now. This graph is actually the number of sessions that we provided, and the blue lines on the left of the graph are face-to-face sessions. The orange lines in the middle of the graph are remote sessions, and the blue lines towards the right-hand side of the graph is as we've introduced face-to-face sessions again. And I will just put brackets around that and say face-to-face sessions with PPE, because it is not a return to anywhere near normal, and we'll discuss that later. If you see on the left-hand side of the graph, February we have lots of half terms and holidays. So the three lines on the left-hand side of the graph show the variation that we can be between top and bottom of the number of sessions that we actually can provide in any one given week. But what you can see is from March, confidence was dropping. It was dropping like a stone. Our patients were starting to disengage. People were starting not to come to clinic because they were choosing not to because of the risks. And then around the 23rd of March, the instruction came through. We turned it round in about 2 days. There was an incredible amount of hard work and dedication from the team in order for them to turn it round. What you can see is we had a great uptake, but more importantly, it wasn't that we were a novelty factor. I mean, how many people swore in lockdown that they were going to learn a new instrument or stick with Joe Wicks every single morning? What we have here is some sustainability. I think one of the questions that was put through was, how can you tell about satisfaction with regards to patient involvement in remote therapy sessions? Our patients didn't disengage. I think engagement is a key thing when we're talking about satisfaction. They were asked at the end of every session, did they want to see another session? And the answer was yes. So I think the sustainability here is really, really key. And you can see that we are beginning now to introduce those face-to-face contacts, but we are very much still a blended approach between face-to-face contacts and remote therapy. May I have the next slide, please? So I think the first thing we problem solved in peer support is that physiotherapy remotely is not the same as physiotherapy face-to-face. And I think that was kind of the biggest hurdle you have to get over. You can't try and deliver it through a screen. And as obvious as that sounds, I think when I listen to some of the comments that are going on Twitter and some of the frustrations that people are having, it is stepping that bit back. And we had to say to ourselves, well, if we haven't got our hands and we can't touch people, what do we do? And we are fantastic educators, we are motivators, we are facilitators, we are teachers, we are problem solvers and task analysis. So what we did is, whereas before perhaps we would go and spend most of our time working with the patient in a hands-on capacity, and towards the end of the session it would move over towards, let me show you how to do this, this is something you can practice between now and the next session. The session completely flipped, and it was very much, let me demonstrate to you, let me show, let me teach, can you show me how you do this? And it was very much that we moved on to an education footing. I had to learn sometime, somebody had to teach me, and so I have turned into being an educator. And I think there have been discussions about whether remote therapy is cheaper or less cost effective. I don't think comparing physiotherapy remotely with physiotherapy face to face is comparable, because the two things are coming at things from completely different angles. It will be really interesting as we come out of this lockdown. I think a lot of my families, a lot of my patients are much more empowered and much more in control of their therapy than they were before, as to how they take this forward. May I have the next slide, please? So that was from my patient's perspective and what we did a bit for my patients. My team have been on a phenomenal learning curve. As I said, we are not very tech savvy. And I think the other thing when we're thinking about remote therapy that we have to take into account is the various platforms. And there is no ideal platform. There is no platform that has got all the answers, that doesn't come without its problems. And what we had to learn was we had to get familiar not only with using the tech, but also the possibilities and the downfalls. WhatsApp, and we do a large number of sessions through WhatsApp, is a small screen, but it's very, very portable and very, very movable. Very different to perhaps a laptop, which has got Zoom on, which is a large screen and quite static. We not only had to work out what we could see, but we also had to work out what the patient could see. And we have found that physiotherapy, surprise, surprise, is not a desk job. And we have built treatment areas which are pretty much a mat with a therapist sitting on what is the equivalent of a step box, which provides the right angle when they're sitting down, but also allows the physiotherapist to stand up and demonstrate a full exercise. So it was very much problem solving. We've learned screen sharing. Who'd have known what that was? And as we've learned these different screen sharing tools, we have become more innovative and more in what we're doing. So we will often video ourselves before the session and then play the video to the patient, say, can you see this is how I am moving? Can you see this is where my knee moves? Let's now look at a video of you. Can you see that your knee doesn't move at the same time? Can we now practice this together? And I think as a team, we've then been sharing best practice and inspiring each other to move. We had one family who has a sensory impaired youngster, and one of my team designed a TheraBand game because mum was struggling with homeschooling and to fit physiotherapy in. So she designed a TheraBand game, which then the whole family could work together. So physiotherapy became part of the family's daily school. I think we are coming to the point where we're universally across the team recognising that remote has its place, and it has the capacity to improve rehabilitation in the future. But we're also beginning to understand and value our hands so much more than we ever did. I think we're appreciating that more and more as we're going back out now, and now we're appreciating the constraints that PPE are putting us under. We are having to work in gloves, so touch is not what it used to be. We're having to work in masks, and patients are struggling to understand our expressions on faces. So having had staff wanting to do this, they're now saying that they want to go back because remote actually offers something else. May I have the next slide, please? So the other thing I had to do is, as a business owner, is learn how to communicate with Glen, solicitors, case managers about what it was we're doing. We're getting much more confident and actually saying this works, this doesn't, and having to be honest in what it is that we can and we cannot achieve. And we are reflecting on the both positive and negative experiences for our staff of working virtually. I think everybody's heard of Zoom fatigue. It's one thing doing a meeting and the concentration that takes. 6 sessions back to back as a physiotherapist is very, very hard work. We're also beginning to understand the real cost to our business. One of the things we are missing more than anything is that we used to travel between our patients in cars, and we used to appreciate that reflection time, and we don't get that anymore. and we are evaluating why we're going in back to face and justifying it every time. And we do consider that we are going to be having a blended approach for some time soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I think that gives a really good sort of summary of how many people's thought processes would have been developing during that period, the fork in the road, and also how they go about deciding what to do, how to do it, and the implications on both themselves, their team, and their business. Thank you to those that have started to submit some questions. What was encouraging, and as they say in their question as well, a little bit depressing, was that they worked with some remote therapy back in the 90s. They found that the sort of traditional approach of the Maitland approach, the manual therapy, gave about a 39% improvement, while one of the remote approaches and self-treatment approaches actually gave 123% of improvement. So there's somebody out there who's had obviously a very positive experience from remote therapy in the past, but this again, by all accounts, was in a musculoskeletal setting and in relation to chronic low back pain. They do say in their question that they're now using these similar techniques within the field of acquired brain injury, which is really encouraging and shows that there has been some transition of taking these techniques across to the ABI and TBI setting, and they talk about the Melzack pain model and the brain smudging associated with ABI. So that's really good feedback to start with. Another question in here from Jackie for you, Susan, is what do you think are the key learning points in this initial phase in the pandemic, and those key learning points that might help therapists manage the potential second wave or this current period of transition that we appear to be in now? Susan.
Susan, you're on mute.
Apologies, I was on mute. I think that what I said was, I think the key learning point is we have to embrace this and we have to meet this challenge. And what we have just published, and I'm quite willing to share, is we've just done our top 10 tips for remote therapy, which we're quite willing to share with anybody, but it is a very practical exercise, and I think it's got to be the 3 key words that we use all the time is that our sessions need to be safe, meaningful and realistic. So I think it's embrace it, but accept that it is different.
Thank you, Susan. One of the other questions that we've had in, and really I think it refers really to the double-edged sword nature of virtual sessions, the filming, the actual process of taking images, recording, etc. of clients is certainly offers a great format in which to do this. You can slow the images down, you can slow movement down, you can really take a look at how someone's balance is progressing or struggling. But at the same time, there are issues to deal with in relation to consent, in relation to ensuring privacy, and ensuring that the client is comfortable in what is a very vulnerable environment, and then having this onto a recorded setting. Susan, how have you managed with these sorts of issues within the remote therapy environment?
Consent is something that lives with us every day, isn't it? And for me, consent is ongoing and consent is informed, and those are the 2 key words. And I have seen a lot of people have been discussing on forums this issue of consent. The way we dealt with it is, first of all, we asked our patients, do you want to do this? Yes or no? Which medium do you want to use? Tell us how to do it. We then got our admin team to help them set it up. We spoke to them about the importance of having a quiet environment, of making sure the cat was put away. As community physiotherapists, I think we're very used to doorbells ringing and interruptions, and we stop and we deal with those things on the hoof. And I didn't see particularly working via a video as being much different. So we put down rules of engagement as to what was going to happen to make their environment as safe as we possibly could from a confidentiality perspective. When it came to filming, again, it's a consent issue. And we would say, would you mind? Is that okay? And we would get their consent. I know one of the questions was, how do you get signed consent? Well, obviously over a video, you can't do that. We would start the video and we would say, okay, we're going to video you today. Can I just agree that I have your consent to do this? And we would video them saying yes. So we had to find innovative ways around getting the consent that didn't involve a form or a signature. So that's how we've got around the consent.
That's great, thank you, Sue. We've also had a question, or more of a sharing of information from Sue Pattison, who is the clinical specialist physio at London Spinal Cord Injury Centre. And they were very fortunate there in that one of their colleagues had already undertaken extensive research into virtual physiotherapy and remote sessions, and they found that they were very quickly able to undertake a service that would reach all their outpatients in that setting, and also able to put that into their outreach teams for their paediatric service. So the response there and the feedback we're getting there is that's been really, really successful. They're currently using, I know one of the questions we received is what's the best format, what's the best platform in which to do this? And I know Susan mentioned WhatsApp, and there are various others. Sue Pattison at London has said that they use currently Attend Anywhere, but are using more so Microsoft Teams. And I think what Susan said earlier about finding the best one for, there's not always the perfect platform for the specific role. Find what works. We certainly, in my experience, our clients have had varying preferences. Some will only go and contact you by WhatsApp, where others are more happy to use other formats and other software. Susan, have you got a specific format that you use, a preference in a particular situation? I'm thinking more along the lines of assessments, for the times when you're having to get those cameras into places where you need to see certain angles or certain take objective measures, etc. What have you found works best?
I think there is no textbook answer. There is no single answer. It is what works, and I think the different mediums have different advantage. The first thing you've got to have is the patient has got to have the technology. If all they've got is a mobile phone, all you've got is WhatsApp. And I think it's really important for the therapists that are involved to understand the limitations and the possibilities, and don't ask the patient to do something that is beyond the possibilities of the technology. I think the other thing is going back to safe, meaningful and realistic. We have, and the thought of educating, when it has come to objective measures, and I know there have been lots of questions about how do we measure spasticity, how do we measure range of movement. In terms of those things, if my hands are not there, then I either have to educate somebody else's hands or choose a different objective measure. So, for example, if we were looking at spasticity, if we were perhaps looking at sit to stand, I might choose a 30-second sit to stand test in which I could count the number of sits to stands, record it, and I could actually observe the carrying angle of the associated reaction. And then I could remeasure that at another point in time. We have been working with individuals to meet their individual goals. We have not been looking at populations, so we have not been looking at objective measures across populations.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And Andy, I hope that's met the answer to your question that you've posted as well. I think, as Susan said, there's no real sort of single answer to these kind of question. The objective measures is a difficult challenge in a virtual setting, and I think it's about finding the best way in which we can respond and work with what we've got. There's also one last question on here before we move on to future, because I know that's at the forefront of everyone's mind. I have a question here from Sue, just asking any advice about how to support students in their learning in a remote consultation and remote environment. Susan, have you had any experience of working with students in this setting?
We do normally work with students. We are not working with students at the moment. We have somebody who's coming on a voluntary placement soon. I think consent is the key thing, isn't it? If that a patient is going to have a student present, whether that's a face-to-face contact or a video consultation, then I think it's about consent. I think if you're mentoring a student in whatever you're mentoring, then whether it's face-to-face or it's via video link, that relationship is still the same. I think the thing comes down to, isn't it, often as physiotherapists, because our primary tool is our hands, we often teach using our hands. I think we have just become more experienced over the last 16 weeks at explaining ourselves a bit better. And I think sometimes because we can demonstrate and do so easily, sometimes we undervalue ourselves, the level of skill with which our hands bring. So I think it's learning to explain better. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Right, I am going to move on to future now. We've got a couple more questions. One of them just asking about data protection and GDPR, which I'm sure we could probably run a whole day on with the difficulties encountered in a virtual setting with that. But I am mindful of that. I will get back to you if you leave your email address and we can discuss that further. But I'm going to move on to future. And I think what's clear about this situation is that we're very much all in this together. We are now in a transition. We're seeing what's working, what isn't working. Certainly from our perspective as solicitors, we're finding communication is the key. We need to be collaborative here, and that's both with the insurers, the defendants, as well as our rehab team and the people that we're working with to provide treatment. Now, fortunately, HEADWAY have recently provided us, by way of a little bit of feedback on this, their recent survey, which I would urge you to go and have a look at if you've not done so already, gives a real insight into what clients are experiencing by way of this lockdown period and the effects on how their treatment and remote therapy has affected them. And there are some really powerful statistics in this. You know, there are 50% of them describe that they've lost access to support that they would have wanted. 65% of them feel isolated. And again, more than half of them report increases in frustration, anxiety, fear and isolation. One of the really sort of powerful statistics is that 57% there. So those that sustained brain injury in the last 2 years stated that their access to rehab has been negatively impacted. Now, you'll all know that this sort of 2-year window period that's quoted as being very important in recovery and rehabilitation. And if somebody feels like they're losing 4 or 5 months of that to a situation whereby they can't get any access or can get only a reduced amount of access, then this is something that we clearly have to address. So again, for those of you that are considering or not 100% in either camp with regards to the fork in the road there, if you want in an argument for finding a way around this and getting back to providing treatment and services for your clients, then certainly all the client insight you need is there for you in that report. So it's a case of what do we do now? We're going to look to the future. Where do we take this? And there are lots of ways in which we need to consider what we're going to do. There's the internal factors, you know, the best interest, the needs of the client, are those going to be met? The issues with engagement, how progress is going to be measured. But there's also lots of external factors as well. The external factors such as the professional guidance, the standards that we have to continue to adhere to in order to provide that treatment, the GDPR requirements, as I've mentioned also, the consent, the documentation, the funding. You know, there's been a couple of questions which we'll hopefully run through at the end of this little segment, but funding is an issue as well. There's been challenges in relation to funding now this switch has gone to remote assessment and treatment. And I think one of the key words that we are discussing on many occasions is expectations. What are the expectations of those that are funding the treatments? What are the expectations of the clients? What are your expectations as treatment providers? What are your expectations of us as solicitors in coordinating that and communicating that? And therefore what I'm going to do for you now is hand over to Susan again, who's going to provide her sort of insight into where she feels this is going to go and where we are going to move towards in the future. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you. I kind of feel we're probably more in the middle of the road than we ever were. I don't know where I'm in Bury in Lancashire. I don't know if you've looked at the geographical maps of where the hotspots are, but at the moment I'm sitting in the middle of Blackburn with Darwin, Oldham, Rochdale. So I think for us, we are looking at remote being with us for quite some time. I mean, let's all hope that we're all safe and we don't have another wave round the corner, but it's looking like a real possibility as we go into winter. So I think we are trying to offer a blended and balanced approach as we go forward, but I think what we are having to recognise is that we've got to avoid, I think, trying to compare face-to-face with remote therapy, because, as I said before, they come at the problem from a completely different angle, and they are different things. And I think if we got into the boat where we started to compare them as like for like, that in itself would cause us problems. As I said before, I think we're going into an area where we're going back to face-to-face that is in a very, very different place. The face-to-face that I'm going back to with PPE is not the same. I was discussing with Glen before that we are facing issues regarding, because of the way physiotherapist works, there's a leg over one shoulder, or, you know, actually contact with uniforms and aprons not covering things. There are some real practical day-to-day problems that we've yet to tackle as we start to resume our face-to-face. And as I said, there are therapists coming back saying that they would actually prefer having problem solved this remote thing. So I think as we're coming out of this, we're almost facing more questions, more challenges than we did as we went into it. And I don't think the switch is going to go back. But I think we do have to recognise that remote therapy is possible. The question long term is going to be whether it's preferable. But I think if we are ever going to look at whether it's preferable, I do think we have to recognise that we are sitting in a very, very unique bubble. Lockdown, I think there were things within lockdown that helped it succeed because nobody was doing anything else. Joe Wicks was on the telly, so why wouldn't you consider physiotherapy via remote access? It was very, very acceptable. I think going forward, going back to the HEADWAY survey, we have to think about how we keep our patients engaged, and we have to have patients engaged face-to-face and non-remote. And I think we have to accept from the HEADWAY that virtual is probably better than no input whatsoever. I think when it comes to some of the challenges as to whether people accept it and whether they will pay for it, I think it's our responsibility as physiotherapists to communicate effectively what it is that we can do and we can't do. And I think we've got to not be defensive about that, but take that responsibility forward and as part of what we're doing to evidence the decisions that we've been making. And I think we have to accept the responsibility that we are actively problem solving when the evidence is not there yet. I think what remote therapy does is it allows us to maintain therapeutic relationships, and I think we value therapeutic relationship above anything in the practice. I wouldn't know what response I would be getting from my patients if I was ringing them up after 16 weeks to say, well, I'm ready now. I think if they are said, so where have you been? That's quite a valid question. I think virtual has enabled us to support families through the pandemic on a very steep learning curve. But I think we also have to recognise that there were those patients, and I'm sure everybody has got them in their caseloads, that have gone underground, and we are struggling to keep in contact with them. Even some who had access to video links chose not to, and they are proving very, very difficult to re-engage. So I do think lockdown presented us with a very unique situation, and I think it would be wrong of us to compare and contrast face-to-face pre-lockdown with remote therapy and face-to-face therapy that we're now having now. So I think we've got to be open-minded and we've got to work to get better at this. May I have the next slide, please? I think the other question that often comes up is I'm often asked about what platform, consent forms, you know, things like that. To me, what has driven it in my team was the absolute commitment from my therapists that actually said, we are going to do this. We're not going to leave our patients behind. We are going to work this out. And it was the hours and hours and hours that they spent and still spend problem solving. How can I do this? How can I do that? We had a lady who was ready to climb the stairs. I mean, that just would have given me the collie wobbles 16 weeks ago to do that remote, but we actually managed it. We broke it down, we delivered it, and we delivered it in a safe and meaningful way. She'd have gone up the stairs with or without us, and it was taking a balanced risk. So I think our therapists have been incredibly inventive, and I think it does need to be recognised that it is the drive of the therapist that is actually pushing this one forwards. It's not the technology itself. I'm glad it was there, but it's not the technology itself that is pushing this forwards. And I just think as therapists, it's up to us to take ownership of it, and is up to us to actually decide which direction this goes in further. And I do think it has the capacity to be a fantastic adjunct to our therapy. It is not a replacement, in my opinion. It is an adjunct, and it's an ability to deliver things differently. And I think as a business owner, I would adamantly argue that it is very definitely not a cheap alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And that gives us a really sort of good insight into how somebody who's dealing with this on a day-to-day basis views the next few months. And I think it's important that Susan identified there, we are very much in the middle of what's going on now. We're certainly not at the end. And so there's a lot of crystal ball gazing here. There's a lot of how are we going to develop this? How are we going to change things? And I think an adjunct to therapy is a very good description of what we have here with remote therapy sessions. It's another valuable tool in the box. It's not really designed to be a replacement for what was already existing. And it can't really be compared as a valid replacement at this stage, because we're not really back to where we were before anyway. Now, whether the expectations and the views of many at the moment are wide and varied, and we have had suggestions that we should move entirely to remote therapy sessions, both from a cost effectiveness point of view, reducing travel costs, reducing mileage and etc. And then right at the other extreme, we've had people suggesting that they just won't comply with a recommendation or fund a recommendation for remote therapy sessions. So with this wide view and wide range of expectations, I think the best way in which we can deal with this and move forward is to certainly be collaborative. And I would hope to be able to pick up the phone and certainly discuss the reasons why a remote therapy should be appropriate in a certain setting. What I'm encouraging my case managers to do, the therapist, the treating rehab team, is to document everything, to talk to me about a modified treatment plan. And I've had some really good experience with this, certainly with working with some of Susan's team, of having a treatment plan that has been modified. It identifies where the advantages of the remote therapy sessions are, but also identifies the shortfalls, what's being missed during this time when face-to-face sessions aren't available. And I think those treatment plans give me a really good insight into what's going on. It doesn't just present a solution and an alternative that's been decided. It shows me the journey to that decision as well, and that's really important for me. And as is the documentation of these sessions that take place. So again, just responding to some of the questions that we've got here, and again, Andy has posed the question, is a return to face-to-face post-COVID ideal? Or is there this combined remote and hybrid approach available? And I think at the moment we're definitely in that stage of considering this hybrid approach. Another question that was put to me by Ed was, what technological developments do we think we're going to experience in this period of time? How's that going to affect treatment? Susan, is there anything technology-wise that you can foresee that's going to really make a difference, or perhaps you would like to work with more to enable your remote sessions to take place more effectively?
I think hopefully, I think technology will move forward, wasn't it? Because we're all, I think what I am seeing is often people will say, oh, well, they won't engage with remote, whereas grandmas, mothers, aunties, uncles are all being taught how to engage with the remote and things like that. So I think the one thing that has changed for the positivity for me has been the accessibility and the inclusion. And I think that will drive technology forward to make it more user friendly. A couple of things we're looking forward to using that we've just discovered. Our occupational therapists are finding they don't want to see the patient's face, they want to see the surface on which the patient is working. And we've just discovered something that has a mirror that reflects what the patient is doing, so that you can actually observe the handwriting or the hand skills. I think that will be really beneficial. We haven't done it yet, but there is, I believe it's the Facebook thing that you can see on the advert that follows the person round. I think from a physiotherapy perspective, not having to move the camera, but have the camera follow the movement would be a fantastic addition. But again, I think, as I say, I mean, for me, it is the inventiveness and the creativity of the therapist that I would like to see recognised first, in terms of what the therapists have actually achieved. And I think information and platforms like this and webinars like this, where we can share experiences, is also going to be really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. I've had a couple of questions about sort of post COVID-19 related rehab, and one about post COVID-19 encephalitis. I think these are quite specialist questions, and certainly with regards to treatment of those, I wouldn't be able to give you any advice on how to progress with those. But certainly from a remote physio and a remote therapy setting, I certainly see this has definitely got a place in reaching out to patients where they have experienced the virus and have come home and need that input. Remote therapy sessions certainly offer that little and often approach, so you can frequently sort of visit someone, catch up just 15 minutes, 20 minutes, etc. So you have little and often, as opposed to the large sort of engagement that's required with going out and doing a face-to-face session with all the PPE in place. Now, Susan has got a little bit of experience in this, so I'm just going to pass over to her.
I haven't actually treated any patients post-COVID, but what I am reading is that fatigue and fatigue management is a massive part of the problems that they're facing. We are all aware of the difficulties of attending an appointment. I think if we can provide something that addresses the fatigue management by reducing the effort involved, I think it's got to be a positive step forward, and I think we need to listen to the problems that the patients are facing. The other thing I'm hearing a lot of is that patients are suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder, and perhaps engaging them in their own homes rather than returning them to the hospital where they were unwell, or asking them to engage in the communities, again, will be a method of dealing with it. I have, like I say, I've had no specific experience in dealing with post-COVID-19 patients, but I think we just need to be wise and use this forum to support them as much as we can, because sadly rehabilitation services were overstretched before the pandemic, and we're going to be even more overstretched. My concern is if it's seen as a cheap alternative to dilute things rather than a positive contributor in terms of reducing post-traumatic stress or reducing fatigue and dealing with it on a clinical need basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And again, just picking up on a couple of questions that are coming through with regards to the technology and the hardware, if you like, that's required in relation to these remote therapy sessions and recovery for those through any litigation that may be taking place. And these are all really valid points about what Susan was saying earlier. These remote sessions don't instantly provide a cheaper alternative. There's huge amounts of things that have to be put in place with regards to this technology, and in many cases the technology just doesn't land on the doorstep ready to go. There's the time needed to set those up. There's the time often engaged in getting family members to come in and make sure it's all working right, and these hours quickly stack up and make these remote sessions really quite time intensive rather than just the pop in, pop out experience that many may perceive them to be. So yes, there is an argument for the provision of technology and also the argument for the extra time that's taken in setting those sessions up. Now, I'm just mindful of the time. I will seek to get back to the questions. Thank you to those of you that have provided your email addresses for those. Our contact details will be on the slides in a little while as well, but also I would urge you all just to pop to the pages on our website, the Owen Mitchell website, where you can access webinars, you can access my contact details, and certainly I would be more than happy to pass on any questions of a clinical nature to Susan. So please do pop onto that website, which Natasha will just show a slide of now. You'll see it looks like that. There's the coronavirus updates and also an insight into how you can access our existing recorded webinars on there. Hopefully you will receive the feedback form for this now. I've got a slide next as well, just with the links on there as well. So these are the links to both the events that we've got coming up in the future and also the feedback form in relation to today's webinar. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are very much in the thick of it all at the moment. This is work in progress. We are working our way through this together, and I'm really, really grateful. And I'd like to thank Susan again for joining me in today and just to share the experiences with you. We've had some really good feedback and engagement from you on the questions, and I'm hoping that you'll join us all again, probably in a couple of months' time, to see where we are at that stage and hopefully discuss what developments have taken place. The best way in which we're going to make this better for everyone, and primarily with the client's well-being and recovery in the centre of that, is if we're discussing it and we're working out these issues. We all know we're experiencing them together. So if we can work through and create the solutions together, we're going to arrive at a place which is better for everyone in a much quicker and more organised fashion. So once again, thank you all for joining me today. Please do check out the webinars. And I look forward to seeing you again at a webinar in the future. Thank you.